The digital clock on my nightstand read 3:14 a.m. when the silence of my apartment was shattered by the shrill tone of my phone. Half asleep and more irritated than alarmed, I fumbled in the dark, my hand finally finding the cold device. The screen glowed ominously, an unknown number flashing on the display. Against my better judgment, curiosity won over annoyance, and I answered, "Hello?" My voice sounded foreign in the quiet of the night. There was a pause, a breath perhaps, then a whisper so faint I thought I might have imagined it. "Don't let them in." The line went dead, leaving me with a dial tone and a rapidly growing sense of unease. I sat up, the remnants of sleep quickly dissipating as I tried to make sense of the call. A prank. Maybe. It wouldn't be the first time, but something about the urgency in that whisper. Shaking off the unsettling feeling, I tried to settle back into sleep. But as the minutes ticked by, a palpable tension filled the room, as if the air itself was thickening, pressing in around me. The city outside my window, usually alive with the distant hum of traffic and the occasional siren, was eerily silent, as if it too was holding its breath. Then came the knock. 3 slow, deliberate raps on my front door. My heart seized. No one had ever knocked on my door at this ungodly hour. The whisper from the phone call echoed in my mind, a chilling premonition. Don't let them in. Every rational thought told me to ignore it, to stay in bed and wait for whoever it was to go away. But then, another knock, more insistent this time, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was awake and pondering whether to answer. I crept out of bed, the cold floorboards creaking under my feet. The knocks continued, a steady beat that seemed to sync with my racing heart. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing but the dimly lit hallway of my apartment building, the other doors standing mute and indifferent. "Who's there?" My voice was barely above a whisper, fear strangling the words. Silence. Then, a soft, almost pleading voice. This is the voice of a middle-aged woman. "Please, I need your help." Something in the tone, a vulnerability, a human quality, tugged at my conscience. Against all reason, I found my hand on the lock, the whispering warning from the phone call battling with the innate desire to help someone in need. My hand trembled, hovering between action and inaction. It was then I noticed it. The peephole, through which I had just been looking, was now dark, as if someone was on the other side, blocking the light. A chill ran down my spine. I hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen a shadow move. The voice came again, closer now, as if right on the other side of the door. "Please, they're coming. Let me in." The desperation in the voice was palpable, but so was the underlying threat, a hint of something sinister beneath the plea. My heart raced, panic setting in. Who was this? What did they want? I backed away from the door, my decision made. No matter the pleas, the knocks, the whispers, I wouldn't open the door. The phone call, the warning, it was all too coincidental, too ominous. I retreated to my bedroom, locking the door behind me, a feeble barrier against whatever horror lay beyond. Then the pleas turned to rants and threats. Open the door right now. I held my breath and leaned against the wall, not daring to make a sound. My heart is filled with questions and fears. Who is she? What to do? And who made that phone call? I started thinking about calling the police. I didn't sleep that night. The knocks continued for what felt like a while, each one a hammer blow to my fraying nerves. Fortunately, the crazy woman finally stopped and did not knock on the door again. As dawn crept into the sky, casting a pale light into my apartment, I ventured out from my bedroom, the events of the night feeling like a distant nightmare. Yet, the silence that greeted me was a stark reminder of the reality of my experience. The air felt charged, heavy with unspoken warnings, and the normalcy of daylight did little to ease the knot of anxiety in my stomach. I approached the door hesitantly, half expecting to find some sign of the nocturnal visitor, but there was nothing. As I turned to head back inside, I noticed a strange symbol carved into the wall by the door with a knife. It felt like my home had been marked by that crazy woman. I didn't hesitate any longer and decided to call the police. The officers told me they had received 2 other reports of similar incidents. They promised to get back to me as soon as possible. In the meantime, if I encountered any more danger, I could contact one of the officers directly. I made sure to keep his contact information. My name's Jamie. I've been a nursing assistant for just over 2 years at a small clinic in rural Idaho. The clinic was old, dating back to the early 1980s, renovated countless times to keep up with modern medicine. It was a chilly October evening. The clinic was quiet. Most of the staff had gone home, and only a few of us were left to tend to the night shift. The walls, a sterile white that seemed to glow under the fluorescent lights, made the night feel colder somehow. The shadows cast by the sparse furnishings stretched long and thin across the floor, like dark fingers reaching out. I was checking on Mr. Henderson, an elderly patient who'd been with us for a few weeks. He was a quiet man, mostly kept to himself, but tonight he seemed agitated. His room was at the end of a long hallway, the last door on the left. The light from his room spilled out into the hallway, a beacon in the dim corridor. As I approached, I could hear him muttering to himself, words too low to make out. When I entered, the room felt colder, a stark contrast to the rest of the clinic. Mr. Henderson sat upright in his bed, his eyes wide and focused on something I couldn't see. "She's here," he whispered, his voice barely above a breath. "Who's here, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "The watcher," he replied, his gaze never wavering from the corner of the room. I followed his line of sight, but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the same beige walls and medical equipment. I checked his temperature, thinking maybe a fever was causing delirium, but it was normal. The room, however, remained unnervingly cold. I offered to get him a blanket, but he refused, his attention still fixed on the empty corner. After making sure he was as comfortable as possible, I left his room, feeling the temperature rise back to normal as I stepped into the hallway. I couldn't shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over me, a feeling that was compounded when I reached the nurse's station. Sitting there was a picture frame I'd never noticed before. It was old, the wood warped and the glass covered in a thin layer of dust. Inside was a black and white photo of the clinic staff, dated 1982. I recognized the building in the background, but what caught my attention was a figure standing at the back. She were out of focus, but I could make out that she were wearing what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform. Her face was obscured, but there was something unsettling about the way she seemed to be staring directly at the camera, directly at me. I was so engrossed in the photo that I didn't hear Dr. Simmons approach. "Creepy, isn't it?" she said, making me jump. I nodded, unable to find my words. "They say the clinic is haunted by a nurse from the early days. Some patients see her, watching them from the corners of their rooms," Dr. Simmons continued, her voice low. I glanced back towards Mr. Henderson's room, a shiver running down my spine. Was Mr. Henderson seeing the ghost of this nurse? And why did it suddenly feel like the clinic was filled with eyes, watching my every move from the shadows? The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and half-seen movements in the corners of my vision. Every time I passed Mr. Henderson's room, I couldn't help but look towards the corner he'd been fixated on, half expecting to see something staring back at me. But it was the next day, in the bright light of morning, that I found something that truly chilled me to the bone. Tucked away in a forgotten file cabinet, I discovered old patient records and, among them, a faded photograph of a nurse. The same nurse from the staff photo, her gaze piercing even through the age-spotted paper. Beneath the photo was a note, written in a neat, looping script. "They never see it coming, do they? The watchers are always here, always waiting. And one day, they'll see you too." I couldn't breathe, the paper trembling in my hands. The words felt like a warning, a prophecy, or maybe a threat. I looked around the brightly lit clinic, suddenly feeling very alone and very watched. The rest of the day was a haze of routine tasks performed under the weight of a gaze I couldn't shake. My every step seemed echoed by unseen feet, every shadow in the clinic a potential hiding spot for the watchers Mr. Henderson had whispered about. Despite the sunlight streaming through the windows, the warmth did little to dispel the cold fear that had lodged itself in my chest since the night before. I decided to confront Dr. Simmons about my find, hoping for some logical explanation or at least some reassurance. But when I mentioned the photograph and the note, her usual composed demeanor flickered, replaced by a brief look of what I could only interpret as fear. "Jamie, sometimes it's best to leave the past where it belongs," she said, her voice tight. "Not everything in this clinic is explainable. Focus on your patients, not on old stories or photographs." Her words, meant to be comforting, only fueled my unease. I barely remember the drive home, my mind a whirlwind of fear and questions. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The next day, I returned to the clinic. Confused, I sought out Dr. Simmons, who looked at me with a knowing eye. "Sometimes, acknowledging the past, giving it voice, is enough to calm restless spirits," she said cryptically. "Or perhaps some mysteries are better left unresolved. The clinic has its guardians, Jamie, watchers who protect this place and its inhabitants. Maybe they decided you're one of us now." There's a part of me that feels comforted, knowing that if they are watching, they're not malevolent. Maybe they're just guardians of a sort, watching over the clinic and those within it. Life at the clinic has returned to normal, or as normal as it can be when you know you're never truly alone. Sometimes, in the quiet moments, I whisper a thank you to the watchers, to Edith, hoping they hear me. I'm a seasoned pilot with over 2 decades of experience under my belt, flying both commercial and cargo flights across the globe. My career has been largely uneventful, save for the usual challenges posed by weather and the occasional mechanical hiccup. However, there's one flight that stands apart, a night that altered the very fabric of what I believe to be true about the world, the skies I thought I knew so well. It was a routine cargo flight from Dallas to Chicago, the kind I've done countless times. The aircraft, a sturdy old bird that had served well over the years, was loaded and prepped for departure. The weather was clear, and forecasts predicted smooth sailing all the way to O'Hare. My co-pilot, a competent young man with a sharp mind and a keen sense of humor, shared my ease about the night's work ahead. We took off without issue, the city lights of Dallas fading into the darkness below us. The flight was quiet, the drone of the engines a constant, comforting presence. Somewhere over Oklahoma, as we settled into the rhythm of the flight, a crackle broke over the radio, a voice cutting through the static with a clarity that sent shivers down my spine. "Brace for impact." The voice was calm, almost serene, but the words sent a jolt of panic through me. I checked the instruments. scanning for any sign of trouble, but everything was as it should be. My co-pilot looked at me, confusion mirrored in his expression. I reached for the radio, intending to clarify the message, but before I could speak, the voice continued. Flight 191, descend to 5,000 feet, heading 270. The specificity of the instructions, the mention of Flight 191, was jarring. Flight 191 had been a tragic accident decades earlier, a disaster that had claimed the lives of all aboard. It was a somber legend in aviation circles, a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of vigilance. My co-pilot and I exchanged a look, a mutual recognition of the absurdity and gravity of what we were hearing. There was no Flight 191, not tonight, not in this sky. I responded to the call, stating our actual flight number and requesting clarification. Silence followed, a heavy, oppressive silence that seemed to fill the cockpit. Then, as suddenly as it had stopped, the static crackled to life again, and the voice returned, its tone no longer calm but edged with desperation. Descending through 6,000 feet, too late, too late. The transmission cut off abruptly, leaving us in stunned silence. My hands were steady on the controls, but my heart raced, the words echoing in my mind. It was impossible, a voice from the past intruding on the present, a warning or a plea from a flight that had met its end long before. We continued our flight, the remainder uneventful but charged with an unspoken tension. When we landed in Chicago, the relief was palpable, but the questions that night raised remained unanswered. I've flown many times since then, the skies as familiar as ever, but the memory of that night lingers. I've researched, pored over records and transcripts, looking for any explanation that would make sense of what we heard. But there's nothing that fits, no logical explanation for a voice from a doomed flight reaching out across the years. Some nights, when the sky is clear and the stars are bright above, I find myself listening a little more intently to the radio static, half expecting to hear that voice again, to be reminded once more of the mysteries that lie beyond our understanding, in the vast expanse of the night sky.